Hello, my name is Jarvis and I am the editor of this website, tselacademic.org, and I'm here to talk about a paper which I've recently published, co-authored paper with my colleague Martha Szymczyk on student views on learning grammar with web and book-based materials, a publication which has recently appeared in the English Language Teaching Journal. The paper reports on a study which examined students' attitudes to learning grammar in self-study, autonomous contexts, and their preferences for the materials with which to do so. Learner training, learner autonomy have of course been with us in English language teaching for many, many years, and the place where these notions tend to be realized are frequently in language resource centres or self-access centres, and it's the materials which are stocked in these centres which are viewed as the materials which allow our students to practice, to study, to work autonomously. So there's long been a link between self-study materials and language resource centres. Of course, in the bygone era, these materials were exclusively paper-based. Students would go to the centres and would work on self-study paper-based materials in order to practice their English. That, of course, has changed. Increasingly, resource centres include not only paper-based materials, but include computer-based materials. And indeed, it would be very difficult to imagine a language resource centre or a self-access centre today without some sort of digitalised provision, some sort of computer-based material provision. And we were interested in looking at materials in centres and looking at the preferences that students have for such materials. I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. In terms of computer-based materials in such centres, these are frequently characterised as tutorial, computer-assisted language learning, tutorial CAL, and they are characterised as having a number of advantages, a number of possibilities, particularly in relation to grammar and students studying grammar by themselves. Grammar is, of course, one of the fundamental areas that students will want to work on in an independent context. Canva Tutor, for example, is characterised as being advantageous for its instant feedback. A student works on a computer-based program, works on the grammar exercise, and they get the answer pretty much instantly, right or wrong. Sometimes that feedback is quite limited. This idea, this facility is sometimes characterised as being particularly advantageous in developing learner autonomy, because it gives them the answer immediately, and they can then either do further work on that area if they've got things wrong, or move on to something more challenging. Historically, of course, it has been argued that computer-based materials in self-study contexts are motivating for the students. So there's this idea that, unlike more traditional paper-based materials, when students work on computer-based materials, that something about those materials motivates the students. Today, of course, these types of computer-based materials are delivered primarily through the web. Years ago they were delivered on CD-ROMs, and we've seen a massive proliferation of websites which provide for our students in a whole range of skills, grammar being one of the top areas, vocabulary another, and so on. Frequently these websites are, of course, available for our students at no extra cost. We've also got the notion of the anywhere, anytime idea with these materials, so students can access these materials whenever they want, 24/7, and work at a time which suits them. So there is this sense that websites would seem to be ideally matched to our students' needs, and such students today have of course been characterized as digital natives, in that this is a term by Prensky, 2001. These students have known nothing but digitalized mediums throughout their lives, many of them. If they're under 22, 23, they haven't had to make that transition from paper-based to digitalized mediums. They've been brought up with digitalized mediums. So you've got this idea that Tutorial Cal and websites for self-study, Tutorial Cal as realized in websites for self-study, matches students' needs, it motivates students, it facilitates learner autonomy, and you've got the idea that much of that study will take place in a resource centre. Throughout this period, of course, we have also seen the ongoing and apparently never-ending development of self-study paper-based materials. So whilst that development has been occurring, the development of computer-based materials, we haven't seen the disappearance of your traditional self-study grammar books. English Grammar in Use, for example, is still with us today, still widely used by students for the self-study of grammar, as it was 5 years ago, as it was 10 years ago. It is, however, quite surprising that within the literature and within the research that there's been very little which has looked at students' preferences for self-study grammar materials, which has looked at the choices that students make when they go into resource centres about what kinds of materials that they're going to work on in order to develop their grammar. And our study is really an attempt to address this shortfall. In our study we asked 3 primary questions. Firstly, what attitudes do students have towards learning grammar outside the classroom? Secondly, do students prefer websites or paper-based self-study resources to learn grammar outside the classroom? And finally, what is the motivational impact of web-based and paper-based self-study resource materials for learning grammar outside the classroom? I'll touch on some of the findings that we came across. I won't go into everything. I'd encourage you to look at the article itself. Our methodology in attempting to address these questions comprised both quantitative and qualitative techniques. We distributed questionnaires and we conducted semi-structured interviews. We asked students to work on 2 sets of materials. So we took a very typical self-study grammar book and asked students to complete some tasks with that publication, and then we took what we considered to be a typical self-study grammar learning website, and we asked students to complete activities on the web, and then we got them to think about which materials they preferred and why. Our findings were surprising in some respects. We weren't surprised to learn that students generally had a fairly positive attitude to learning grammar independently. They considered grammar to be an important part of their studies, and this is consistent with other findings in the literature. We weren't surprised to learn that students thought grammar was an important part of their classroom-based activities, and that needed to be extended beyond the classroom into independent context. We were somewhat surprised, however, to find that overall the pattern seemed to be that students preferred paper-based materials to computer-based materials for studying grammar independently. And this came as something of a surprise, given what I was saying earlier about the digital native students who have known nothing but digitalized mediums throughout their lives, the 24/7 access argument that the internet offers, and so on. We found that a little bit surprising. It's not that students felt that the websites were useless, it's that on balance they seem to prefer more traditional paper-based materials. Among the advantages of self-study books, we can distinguish several areas. Firstly, the students reported the availability of these books, the widespread availability in the resource centre was appreciated, and the availability beyond the resource centre of such books was appreciated. Students reported that these books were clear, they were well organised. They said that the grading of the grammar exercises within the books was comprehensible, that the presentation was good, that the clarity of instructions was noteworthy. So they identified a whole series of very positive features about self-study grammar books. The biggest limitation that they identified was the lack of variety. They reported that these books tended to adopt the same pattern for every single unit, and they would have appreciated more variety in that regard. With regard to the computer-based materials, whilst it can't be considered that students' feedback was negative, it certainly wasn't. Nevertheless, the data suggested a lot more uncertainty about such materials. Students' perception of practicing grammar on the web was generally positive, but they identified more disadvantages as well. The lack of systematic organisation of materials on the web was perceived as a particular limitation with computer-based materials. The role of hypertext and the sense that in some ways hypertext was confusing for them was identified by students as a limitation. There were advantages with computer-based materials, and not surprisingly, having noted what they said about paper-based materials, the variety of materials available on the web was one of the features which was identified as an advantage. But overall, there seemed to be a preference for paper-based materials. So, where does all of this lead us in terms of our conclusions and what we make of all of this? Well, the study suggests that despite the digital native notion, our students have not, under certain circumstances, abandoned more traditional resources, more traditional paper-based resources, and we think it would certainly be a mistake for practitioners and resource providers, language resource centre providers, to slavishly follow digitalized mediums for everything. We detect in some contexts a tendency for resource centres to need to be seen to have all the latest computer technology, and we think that should not occur at the expense of stocking traditional paper-based materials, which are clearly still valued by our learners. Furthermore, we would argue that the potential for blended learning within self-study contexts shouldn't be overlooked. If you look at language resource centre designs and self-access centre designs these days, you will find many examples where the space provided for students assumes that they are only going to be working with a mouse and a keyboard. And we think that this is a mistake, that when designing centres, it's important to provide sufficient space for students to work with computer-based materials and with paper-based materials at the same time as well. So you shouldn't have to be on the computer and then get up and move to go and work with paper. You need to have access to the keyboard, access to a mouse, and you need to have space for your paper-based materials as well. We conclude that tutorial Cal still has a role, clearly, but it shows no sign of replacing paper-based materials. We furthermore draw on a parallel study by myself, Jarvis 2008, which suggests that non-native speakers of English view a wide range of materials as helping with their language learning, irrespective of whether there is an immediate and a direct language learning function to those materials. So when students send emails to each other in English, they view this as helping with their language learning, even though there is no direct tutorial function to that. When students go onto the web to access information in English, they view that as helping with their language learning, even though they may not be directly practicing or developing language skills in a very explicit sense. They may not be using the materials in a tutorial sense. Students clearly recognise the tutorial role of CAL, but equally they are not abandoning paper-based materials. Indeed, arguably, in today's context, in today's self-study context, the computers are, the computer as a medium is as important, if not more important, than the computer as a tutor. And if that's the case, if the computer as a medium is more important, then there is of course the whole question of electronic literacy skills and the need to equip students with the electronic literacy skills in order to operate efficiently, effectively in English in an internet-dominated environment. Things like accessing material from the web and evaluating the validity of that material. Things like email writing functions, the kind of texts that are appropriate when contacting friends with email, vis-a-vis when contacting academic tutors. To conclude then, finally, we argue that despite a very changed context, despite the move to a digitalized world and a computer-based world, we feel that a good old-fashioned self-study grammar book still has a very important role to play in learning for our students in independent contexts. Please do have a look at the article if you're interested in learning more, and have a look at some of my other work on this website if that's of interest to you. Thank you very much then. Goodbye.